Two people decide to start running. The first one tells himself, I will run 3 times a week. He downloads a training plan, buys new shoes, sets an alarm for 6 a.m. For 2 weeks, it works. Then, it's a rainy Monday. He slept badly and the alarm gets snoozed. Then again. Then the shoes end up at the back of the wardrobe. The second person has a slightly different internal experience. She doesn't think of running as a goal she's chasing. She thinks of it as something that runners do. And she has quietly started to think of herself as a runner. On the rainy Monday, she still feels the pull of the warm bed. But there's something else operating now. Something that makes skipping feel faintly inconsistent with who she is. Same behavior, same starting conditions, but very different outcomes. The difference has a name in psychology, and understanding it changes how you approach every habit you have ever tried to build. Hi, I'm Tarun and I'm a behavioral scientist turned entrepreneur. Today, we will dive into the topic of identity-based habits. So most habit advice is built on a goal and willpower model. You decide what you want to do. You track it. You try harder when you slip. You motivate yourself with reminders and streaks and accountability partners. This model is not wrong exactly. Tracking helps. Consistency matters. But it has a structural problem. It treats the habit as something external to you. Something you are trying to do, rather than something you are. When a habit lives entirely outside your sense of self, every instance of doing it requires a fresh decision, a fresh expenditure of motivation. Every morning you have to re-recruit the energy to start. And motivation is not a reliable resource. It fluctuates with sleep, with mood, with how the week is going. The habits that actually stick are the ones that stop requiring active deliberation. They become automatic. They are an automatic response to any context that you go through. You don't decide to brush your teeth every day or every night. You just do it because at some point it became part of how you move through the world. So the deeper question is, what accelerates that transition from effortful decision to automatic behavior? Repetition matters, but there's something that sits underneath repetition and makes it more durable. It's the answer to the question, who is the person doing the repeating? There's a counterintuitive idea in psychology that is worth sitting with. The assumption most of us operate on is that identity drives behavior. You believe you are a certain kind of person and then you act accordingly. But research going back to the 1960s suggests the relationship also runs in the other direction. People observe their own behavior and draw conclusions about who they are. If you find yourself consistently waking up early, you start to see yourself as a morning person. If you find yourself reading every evening, you conclude that you are someone who reads. So behavior shapes identity. Identity is not only an input to action, it is also an output of it. This has a profound implication for habit formation. The loop runs both ways. Behavior builds identity, and identity, once formed, creates a pullback toward the behavior. Here's the mechanism. Once a self-concept is in place, there is a strong psychological drive to behave in ways that are consistent with it. Not to feel good, to feel coherent. A stable sense of self requires that actions line up with how you see yourself. When they don't, there is a quiet but real pressure to restore alignment. This is not motivation in the conventional sense. Motivation is what you need when the behavior is external to you. This is something different. It is a natural tendency to act like the person you believe yourself to be. So when you say, I am a runner, you are not just using different words than I want to run. You are engaging a different psychological system entirely. So there's a study that shows how much weight this single distinction carries, and it was done in a setting that has nothing to do with running. Researchers ran 3 randomized experiments with registered voters ahead of real elections. They made one small change. Some participants were asked how important it is to you that you vote. Others were asked how important it is that you be a voter. Same underlying question, one word difference. Verb versus noun. In one study, 82% of the verb group voted, verified by official state records. In the noun group, it was 96%. A second study in a different state with a different election produced the same pattern. The noun framing, which quietly positions the action as an expression of identity rather than just a behavior, produced meaningfully higher follow through rate. A note of honesty. Attempts to replicate this effect in other electoral contexts have produced mixed results, and the size of the effect likely depends on how personally meaningful the identity already is. This is not a magic trick, but the underlying principle that framing an action as identity expressive changes how committed you are to doing it. It is consistent with decades of research on how self-concept and behavior interact with each other. The practical point is not to recite a phrase every morning. It is to understand what kind of internal representation actually produces durable behavior and build toward that. The most directly relevant research on this comes from exercise psychology, which is fitting. Studies going back to the late 1980s looked at what happens when people think of exercise as part of their identity, as something that describes who they are, versus people who exercise but don't hold that self-concept. The findings are consistent. People who genuinely see themselves as exercisers work out more frequently, engage in a broader range of physical activity, and make more concrete plans to exercise than those who don't hold that self-image. Now, critically, the identity was not simply a consequence of already exercising consistently. In prospective studies where people were tracked forward over time, the self-schema predicted that behavior, the internal label, came first, that behavior followed. A large review of this research published in 2016 found that physical activity identity is among the most reliable predictors of actual exercise behavior in the literature. Now, more reliable in many cases than intentions, attitudes, or even past behavior on its own. This matters because most of us think the sequence only runs one way. You exercise consistently for a while and eventually you earn the label. The research suggests it is bidirectional. Adopting the identity when genuinely held and backed by even small behavioral evidence makes the consistent behavior more likely. The label is not the reward at the end. It is part of the mechanism from early on. And there's a version of this idea that doesn't work, and it is worth naming directly. Saying, "I am a runner" without running is not identity. It is wishful self-labeling. Now, the research is clear that identity statements which have no corresponding behavioral evidence are fragile. We read our self-concept from our actions, not from our declarations. An identity without behavior has nothing to stand on. Studies tracking people as they established new healthy habits found that the median time for behavior to become genuinely automatic was around 66 days. And the range was around 18 to 254 days, meaning there's enormous individual variation. Automaticity is the result of consistent repetition in context, not of affirming a label. What identity does is change the experience of early repetition. It lowers the friction of showing up when motivation is low. It shifts the internal question from "do I feel like doing this today?" to "is this what someone like me does?" But the repetitions still have to happen. The identity grows stronger each time they do. Small behavior, identity reinforced. Easier next behavior, identity deepened. It is not a shortcut, it is a different kind of engine. First, audit how you are currently framing the habit you want to build. Is it something you want, something you are trying to do, or something you are? The framing is not cosmetic. It determines which psychological systems engage. Second, start small enough that the identity can form honestly. A 10-minute run you actually complete is worth more to your self-concept as a runner than a full training plan you abandoned on day 5. Each completed instance is a small piece of evidence in favor of the identity that you're trying to develop. Now, each skipped instance works against it. Third, be patient with the gap between the label and the feeling. In the early weeks, calling yourself a runner or a reader or a meditator will feel slightly aspirational, maybe even slightly false. That is not a sign that process is not working. It is what the early phase of identity formation always feels like, before the behavior catches up to the self-concept. The goal is not to build a habit. The goal is to become the kind of person for whom the behavior in question requires no decision at all. Identity is one of the most reliable routes to get there. Now, all the research behind this video is cited in the description. And tell me in the comments, what habit are you working on right now? And how do you currently frame it to yourself? And subscribe for more of why we do what we do. Thanks for watching.